Imagine King Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, seated on his magnificent throne, surrounded by unimaginable riches. He was admired by all, but he also had a restless heart. Solomon loved many women, women who came from distant lands, carrying different cultures, customs, and beliefs. They were beautiful, mysterious, and alluring, but according to God's laws, these women were forbidden to him. Why? What was so dangerous about these unions? Would the wisest king ignore the divine warning? And if so, what were the consequences of his choices? In this video, we will understand Solomon's story, explore the reasons behind this prohibition, and discover how these women influenced not only the king, but the fate of the entire nation of Israel. Get ready for a story full of love, tough choices, and profound life lessons. King Solomon is remembered in history as one of Israel's wisest and richest leaders. His wisdom, which was a special gift from God, caught the attention of many in his time. In addition, he accumulated impressive riches, becoming the most prosperous king Israel ever had. Solomon also became famous for his great works, such as the construction of the magnificent Temple of Jerusalem, considered one of the wonders of his time. However, another aspect that draws attention to his life is the large number of wives he had. No other king of Israel came close to his numbers. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines, something that still piques the curiosity of Bible readers today. Many people see Solomon's large number of marriages as something related to pleasure. However, the reality is that this ended up being the reason for his downfall. Many of Solomon's wives came from unions that were not allowed, and these relationships played a central role in the decline of his reign, which was once so grand. In this video, you will understand why Solomon had so many wives, who the forbidden women were, and how these relationships impacted his life and his kingdom. To begin with, it is important to know that most of Solomon's wives were princesses from other countries. He married them to create political alliances with neighboring nations, a common practice at that time to ensure peace agreements. However, this strategy brought great spiritual problems for Solomon and also for the people of Israel. In the Old Testament period, it was normal for kings and leaders to have many wives and concubines. This practice was common in various cultures of the ancient Middle East. In fact, there are records of kings who had more than 2,000 women in their harems, a number much greater than Solomon's. In Israel, this practice of having more than one wife, although it was not the ideal standard established by God from the beginning, was tolerated and even regulated in certain aspects by Mosaic law. King David, the father of Solomon, also had many wives and concubines, and it's likely that Solomon inherited some of them as part of the royal harem. This pattern continued with Rehoboam, Solomon's son, who had 18 wives and 60 concubines. At that time, it was common for kings to use marriages as a political strategy. These relationships served to form alliances with other kingdoms. Solomon followed this practice and used it extensively to expand his power and strengthen his diplomacy. An example of this is that during Solomon's reign, Israel hardly faced threats from other peoples, showing how effective his political alliances were. However, the Bible suggests that not all of Solomon's marriages had purely political motives. In 1 Kings 11, it is mentioned that he joined his wives in love, which indicates that Solomon felt something for them beyond strategic interests. In other words, he did not marry solely for politics, but also out of desire. This ultimately led him away from God, as his emotional and physical involvement with so many women caused him to forget the Lord. Although the Bible records that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, interestingly, only one of them had her name mentioned in the biblical text: Naamah, an Ammonite woman. Most scholars agree that Naamah was likely Solomon's first wife, as she was the mother of Rehoboam, Solomon's crown prince, born even before he took the throne of Jerusalem from David. The Bible also tells that Solomon married the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, but does not mention her name or the Pharaoh's name. Some scholars believe that this pharaoh might have been one of the last of the 21st Egyptian dynasty. In addition to her, Solomon had many other wives of different origins. The Bible says he loved various foreign women, such as Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, in addition to the pharaoh's daughter. These marriages show how he related to people from various nations. Despite Solomon having many wives, the Bible issues a clear warning against the kings of Israel marrying many women. This warning is in Deuteronomy 17:17. However, Solomon was the king who most ignored this divine guidance. There was a clear directive from God for the people of Israel to avoid marriages with women from other nations. This recommendation aimed to protect the Israelites from spiritually straying and starting to worship other gods. However, Solomon chose to ignore this directive. The prohibition was not because of the women's origins, but because of the risk of negative spiritual influence they could bring. This danger was real, and unfortunately, the Israelites fell into this mistake several times throughout their history. An example was during the time of Moses, when many were drawn to the immorality of the Moabites. Solomon's many wives were not merely ornaments in his court, they greatly influenced his life and choices. Many of these women were from other nations and brought their religious beliefs and practices with them. Over time, they led Solomon away from God, prompting him to build altars to the gods they worshipped. Solomon not only allowed this idolatry to occur, but also ended up participating in these pagan practices. Solomon followed gods like Ashtoreth, worshipped in Tyre and Sidon as the goddess of love and fertility, and Milcom, the chief god of the Ammonite people. These gods were associated with extremely immoral and even cruel practices, such as human sacrifices. By allowing and engaging in these rituals, Solomon not only disobeyed God, but also compromised the faith and spirituality of the entire people of Israel. At the beginning of his reign, Solomon was granted extraordinary wisdom by God, but over time, he let his heart drift away from God. By marrying women who did not share faith in the Lord, he disobeyed divine guidance, which brought severe consequences. His heart, once completely devoted to God, eventually became divided. This led to idolatry and the abandonment of true faith, and his choices ultimately contributed to the division of the kingdom of Israel during the reign of his son, Rehoboam. Solomon was undoubtedly one of the wisest, most prosperous, and powerful kings the world has ever known. During the early years of his reign, he stood out for his justice, discernment, and deep connection with God, receiving divine wisdom that allowed him to govern with excellence. Under his leadership, Israel reached an unprecedented level of wealth and influence, with the kingdom becoming a center of trade, culture, and admiration from neighboring nations. The Temple of Jerusalem, built under his direction, became a symbol of God's glory and the spiritual commitment of the people of Israel. However, Solomon forgot that the true essence of the success of his reign lay not in his material achievements or his fame, but in his spiritual alliance with the Lord. Over time, his heart was seduced by riches, power, and primarily by the carnal love he harbored for his many wives, most of whom were foreigners and worshippers of other gods. He disregarded God's warnings and got involved with women who did not share his faith, marrying them to establish political alliances and strengthen his empire. This attachment to unbelieving wives eventually surpassed his love for God. Gradually, Solomon began to tolerate pagan practices and later participated in them. Altars were erected to foreign gods in Israel, something unthinkable for a king chosen by God. This spiritual deviation was not just a betrayal of his personal faith, but also had a serious impact on the people of Israel, who began to drift away from God and adopt idolatrous practices. The Bible does not hide the weaknesses and errors of its great characters. It presents us with heroes of faith, complete with all their virtues and flaws, revealing that even the most noble can stumble. Solomon, known for his divine wisdom and extraordinary achievements, is a clear example of this. His life proves that a promising start does not guarantee a glorious end, especially when the heart strays from God's path. Solomon began his reign with a humble spirit, seeking God above all else. His prayer to the Lord, asking for wisdom to govern, demonstrated a deep divine dependence. In response, God not only granted him incomparable wisdom, but also riches and glory like no other king in Israel had received. However, over time, Solomon's heart began to stray. He allowed his love for riches, power, and political alliances to override his commitment to God. By marrying hundreds of foreign women, many of whom were worshippers of pagan gods, he opened the doors to idolatry within Israel. The Bible shows us that God, in his justice, did not ignore Solomon's sins. As a consequence of his disobedience, the Lord allowed adversities to arise. Internal and external adversaries began to threaten the stability of his kingdom. Despite his justice, God did not fail to demonstrate his mercy. Out of love for David, Solomon's father, and because of the covenant made with him, the Lord promised that he would not take the kingdom away from Solomon during his lifetime. He ensured that the dynasty of David would continue, preserving the lineage that centuries later would culminate in the birth of Jesus, the promised Messiah. The story of Solomon's wives is not just a historical record, but also a lesson full of profound teachings for Bible readers. It shows us how choices, especially those related to relationships, can have consequences that span generations. Solomon, with his unmatched wisdom, received a privileged position and extraordinary gifts from God, but still allowed his heart to be seduced by desires and interests that drew him away from the divine plan. Throughout his life, Solomon accumulated an impressive 700 wives and 300 concubines, many of them from foreign peoples. These marriages, largely motivated by political alliances and the desire to consolidate his power, ultimately compromised his spirituality and his covenant with God. The foreign wives brought with them idolatrous practices and pagan rituals, which not only corrupted the king's heart, but also negatively influenced the people of Israel, encouraging them to stray from the true God. If it was indeed Solomon who wrote Proverbs 18 and 22, where it reads, "He who finds a wife finds something excellent. He has received a blessing from the Lord." It is possible that at some point in his life, he understood the value of a relationship blessed by God. Perhaps he reflected on how just one wife, wisely chosen and living in harmony with divine principles, could have been enough for his happiness and spiritual growth. However, the desire for power, the pursuit of pleasure, and the pressures of his political context led him down a path that compromised not only his relationship with God, but also his inner peace. The lesson we draw from this story is clear. The relationships we build have a profound impact on our spiritual and emotional lives. Solomon, who began his reign with a heart devoted to the Lord, ended his days with a divided heart, influenced by choices that distanced him from God. His many wives, instead of being a source of blessing, became a stumbling block. This narrative also warns us about the dangers of ignoring divine guidance. God, in his wisdom, had instructed the people of Israel not to marry women from nations that did not share the same faith, precisely to prevent them from being led to idolatry. However, Solomon ignored this commandment, and the consequences were devastating, not only for him, but also for the kingdom of Israel. Ultimately, the story of Solomon's wives is a powerful call for reflection on the centrality of God in our relationships and decisions. This narrative challenges us to examine the choices we make and the priorities we set in our lives. Solomon, despite his wisdom and the extraordinary gifts he received, allowed his relationships to distance him from God, demonstrating how even the most blessed can fall when they ignore divine principles. The story of Solomon teaches us that the foundation of any enduring and meaningful relationship must be the will of God. When we seek partners, whether for marriage or partnerships in other areas of life, it is essential that these relationships align with the values and direction God has given us. Solomon failed in this aspect by prioritizing political alliances and carnal desires, rather than seeking divine guidance. As a result, his choices not only compromised his spiritual journey, but also negatively influenced an entire nation. Additionally, the story highlights that the quality of a relationship surpasses any quantity or external appearance. Solomon, with his 700 wives and 300 concubines, illustrates that having a lot does not mean having enough. True satisfaction in a relationship does not come from numbers, status, or superficial advantages, but from a connection grounded in God's love, faithfulness, and spiritual communion. A relationship that glorifies God, reflects His love, His grace, and His purposes, and is a source of strength and joy in all circumstances. This account also reminds us that God does not call us just to find a spouse, but to build a union that is a testimony to His goodness and His plan for our lives. A marriage according to God's heart is one that reflects the partnership between Christ and the Church, based on sacrificial love, patience, mutual respect, and unity in purpose. It is not free of challenges, but it is sustained by the presence and grace of God, who guides and strengthens those who seek to walk according to His principles. Finally, the story of Solomon is a warning, but also an invitation. It alerts us about the dangers of ignoring God's will in pursuit of personal achievements or temporary gratifications, but also invites us to reevaluate our priorities and redirect our hearts toward the Lord. True happiness and fulfillment are not found in riches, power, or relationships based on fleeting interests, but in a life centered on God, who sustains us, guides us, and gives us purpose in all stages of life. It is a reminder that when we place God at the center of our relationships, we find joy and peace that transcend any circumstance. Now, write in the comments if you already knew this story about Solomon's wives. Leave a like, share this teaching with more people, and subscribe to the channel to watch more videos like this. May God bless you.